Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to our third keynote from Library 2.013. We've had a great day so far. Really a fun year for this conference. Roy Tennant is here. Roy, welcome.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the conference sponsors and supporters. A huge thanks to San Jose State University for their founding partnership of the conference, to Follett, to Blackboard Collaborate and EdWeb, and to all of the terrific partners, many of whom are on this slide and many more on the website. There will be a Connected Educator Month badge for this event. The Connected Educator Month program has been actively promoting this through the U.S. Department of Education's project, and when we get to the end of the keynote, I'll put up a slide with the correct badge link and the ID for you to get a badge for this session. This is a chance for those of you who are here live in the room to indicate where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map. You're going to click on the star twice and then click on the map. It's fun if you put your location and any details in the chat as well. Roy, looks like you've got an international audience. Hooray, hooray.
No pressure.
Portland, Pennsylvania, Sydney, Long Beach. I'm seeing New Zealand. Looks like Hawaii. Minneapolis, Southern California. Ukraine, love that. Okay, keep putting those notices in the chat, but I'm going to move us forward here so Roy has as much time as he needs. Roy, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for taking time out of your day to be here, whatever time of day it is for you. I'm going to start by doing something you almost never hear a speaker do, and that is admit their age. I am 56 years old. At 17, I volunteered at a small public library in Indiana. And ever since then, I've worked almost exclusively in libraries. So for nearly 40 years, I've had an up-close and personal view of the impact of information technology changes on libraries. In fact, since before I graduated from library school in 1986, I've made it my professional goal to occupy the spear tip of information technology change. Mostly I've been successful at that. For example, in 1992, I co-authored the first book on the internet aimed at the library profession, which was also one of the first dozen published for non-engineers. However, just to put some perspective on that, that same year, I was on the committee at UC Berkeley that decided to go with Gopher instead of the web for our Internet Information Service. And of course, we all know how well that turned out. So although I'm going to, in this talk, describe some technologies that may be transformative, I could also be wrong, dead wrong. Keep that in mind and be a critical information consumer. Regardless, I can personally attest that libraries have been on the brink of systemic and transformative technology change since at least the early 80s, if not before. And in a minute, I'll briefly recap some of that history just to provide some context to the rest of my talk. So from my perspective, we're not really falling off a brink so much as skiing down it. But in order to ski without killing ourselves, we need to avoid trees, boulders, and cliffs. Therefore, we need to acknowledge that we have some serious challenges before us and meet them with some imagination and skill. So what are some of those challenges? These are just a few of the structural challenges I see the libraries are facing today. First of all, viable alternatives. You know, it wasn't all that long ago that if you wanted to find out, for example, the gross domestic product of France, there's really only one place to go, your library. And you might pick up the phone and call a reference desk. You might go there and get some help in looking that up. But we were pretty much the only game in town. Now no one goes to a library for that. You know, you use Google. So instead of settling our bar bets by going to the library, we just pull out our smartphone and we type in our question and we have our answer. So that's just one example of many that I could give where there's now viable alternatives to things that libraries used to provide solely for society in the past. We also, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, have some really broken e-content access models, which really aren't our fault, but we have to put up with these publishers who only want to rent us ebooks in particular kinds of ways, which really get in the way of us providing service to our end users. And that really needs to change, because right now it's easier, and in some cases probably even cheaper in terms of lost time and so forth, to simply go to Amazon and get something on your Kindle than it is to go to a library. We also have our metadata entrapped in a standard that's decades old, and I won't dwell on that because I want to touch on that a little bit later. And then, of course, just generally speaking, decades of traditions that are hard to overcome, staff that need to be reskilled, and of course, our user communities who have changing needs and new kinds of needs than they've ever had before. So there's some real serious challenges that we have to face kind of going forward. And I'm going to touch on at least some of those a little bit later, as well as some opportunities we have. But first, I want to provide a little bit of historical context, because I think that might help, especially the younger ones among us, to have a sense of how we arrived here and how quickly things have changed, and that libraries have been changing very rapidly over the last 20 years or more. So to take us, fairly far back, but really not all that far, when I first started working in libraries when I was 17 in a small public library in Indiana, we still had a number of cards in our card catalog that were written out in library hand. And this was a particular kind of cursive that was actually trained for librarians to write very readable cursive. And that was kind of the first technology, library hand and card catalogs. And then that gave way, as of course, to typewritten cards and so forth. So it wasn't too much longer then that the typewriter became kind of the pivotal piece of technology within a library, besides, of course, the card catalog itself. And the typewriter held sway for a number of decades. So from the early 1900s with the manuals all the way into the late 60s with the IBM Selectric, which I would argue was the pinnacle of typewriter technology. I actually bought one of those to get me through college in the 80s, and it looked exactly like the one pictured there. And it's worth pointing out that this technology change was fairly stable for a number of years. It just got a little bit incrementally better, but it stayed there for decades until this happened. When the microcomputer came along, it was obvious to me even in the early 80s, in like 81 or 82, that computers were going to transform libraries. So I actually started programming on the PET Commodore in like 81 or 82 in BASIC, really bad code, by the way, and actually programmed a library tutorial in BASIC before I actually entered in college to get my degree. In, say, 82 to 85 area, I was actually the operator of the PDP 1170 in Humboldt State. This was a CLSI circulation system. And an interesting aspect of that, besides the fact that the disk packs for this system were these huge platters, several times larger than a Frisbee, and you'd have 4 or 5 in a stack, and they would store less information than is on the smartphone in your pocket today. And so we had this system to run our circulation, but it didn't take long before we figured out that perhaps we should put a terminal in front of the public so they could look things up on it. And I thought that was an interesting development where we had a de facto library catalog, which really was a circulation system. Therefore, it wasn't designed for the public to actually use well. And that's partly why our systems have sucked for so many years, is because they were really never designed at the get-go for users, but rather for staff. By 1984, this had happened. We had the Macintosh released, and this made pretty much everyone a desktop publisher overnight. Whereas, before, putting together flyers and things like that were a matter of literally cut and paste, or going to a graphic designer. The Macintosh was the first computer that really enabled people to do that kind of thing on the computer, and that was a very big change. However, in terms of library technology, things were still stuck largely in print. So when I started to go to library school in 1985, we were still largely using these things here, the print indexes. Within a couple of years, we started to see the CD-ROM databases come along. And an interesting thing about that is we would have students at UC Berkeley line up at the InfoTrack CD-ROM search station and wait to use that with their backs turned to the print index. So they'd rather wait on the computer, and actually it was a really pretty crappy system at that point, rather than use the manual lookup of the indexes. So I thought that was an interesting thing to see at the time. In library school at that time, we were doing this kind of thing. This was an acoustic coupler modem operating at about 300 bits per second, eventually 1200 bits per second, and searching the dialog system for information. This is also the green screen era. This was a terminal you might see, for example, in the basement of a building on a campus, and you might be writing programs in Pascal or Fortran or languages such as that on terminals like this. And then, of course, we also had the onset of bulletin board systems. So this is when the internet was in the really early days, and rather than having even Gopher, we had bulletin boards, Usenet news groups, listserv lists, things like that, that we could use. But the real internet revolution didn't really happen until 1993, when Mosaic was released. And an interesting thing about that is my twin daughters were born early in 1993. And so I was realizing today that they have not lived without the web. And they're now 20 years old, halfway through college, and they've never known a world without the World Wide Web. So, and I'm sure for many of you that's probably the case as well. And meanwhile, these days, we all carry the internet around in our pockets. So that's just a kind of a quick journey through library technology to illustrate a few things that I'm going to talk about now. One is that revolutions are spread irregularly. That is, you might think that progress is constant, that we constantly get better and move along and so forth. But in fact, it's not constant. It has jumps and pauses and fits and starts, and it's very irregular. One illustration of that might be, for example, the Apple Newton, which some of you who are older might recall. And the problem with that is it was basically way before its time. It was a personal digital assistant before we were actually even ready to get our minds around what a personal digital assistant was. So it wasn't until later when the PDAs, as they came to be known, operated within that niche between feature phones and smartphones. So there was that period of time where we were getting more sophisticated with our technologies, but mostly people still had feature phones. It was before we really kind of figured out the smartphone market and capabilities. So PDAs were around for a period of a few years, and then basically they were replaced by smartphones. So don't imagine that progress kind of moves along in a steady state. Also, to kind of give a sense of how quickly things have changed, OCLC created this timeline for one of their publications recently, and I'm not expecting anyone to read this, but the swath that I'm looking at here, that I've depicted here, is the century of 1900 to 2000. And I just want to point out that in terms of this graphic, we had to take up half the space of the graphic to talk about just the last 20 years of that century in terms of information technology. So a lot happened in the last 20 years of the 20th century. And I think, that kind of helps you get the sense that things have been moving extremely fast over the last 20 years. Also, excuse me, as you can probably imagine, the consequences of some of these changes are very difficult to predict. So, for example, even after the internet came along, and a lot of people were saying, oh, the Library of Congress is all going to be online before long. That was very hard to predict, actually, at the time, because digitizing content was still very expensive and time-consuming. And so I even debated Rich Wiggins at Computers and Libraries as late as 2002 on that very topic, and predicted that the library, I argued on the side that the Library of Congress would never be fully online. And then, of course, as you know, this happened. So, in a way, who could have predicted that a company like Google, A, would have come along, it was incorporated in 1998, and B, made as much money as it did, and C, decide to put so much money into digitizing library content. That would have been extremely difficult to predict, even as late as 2002, and yet, that's what happened. So, a point I want to make here is that game changers are very difficult to predict. So in 1995, it still would have been very difficult to predict that there would be a Google in the state that it is today, where its stock, for example, just hit $1,000 a share. Also, one revolution can be the prerequisite for another. And this is where you get kind of the cascading effect of innovation. So, it's like we needed the internet to enable Mosaic, and we needed Mosaic to enable the web, and we needed the web to enable internet-based commerce and really just about everything that we do online these days. So one thing led to another, which led to another, which led to another, created opportunities, and so we get innovations building on innovations. Likewise, we needed, the clunky IBM PC in order to eventually get to where we have the internet in our pocket. Now, my final point is probably the most important, and that is true revolutions are personally empowering. That is, the things which truly change society tend to be things which give individuals more ability and more power. So plenty of examples of this. The automobile, for example, was truly transformative to society, and it was also personally empowering. And, just think about the kind of impact that the automobiles had upon society in so many ways. It has actually transformed our landscapes in various ways. Of course, not all good by any means, but it has definitely changed things, and it has also personally empowered people. So, in that context, then, I want to take a look at a few things which I think are today's personally empowering, disrupting technologies. Some of which is still questionable. We still don't know what the impact may be. Others which I think we are already, well along in experiencing. So the three I want to take a look at is everything's online, the Maker Revolution, and MOOCs. But as I do this, I want you to keep in mind the Gardner hype cycle. Hopefully you're all familiar with this, but if not, I really recommend that you take a look at this. And basically, it's a way for us to kind of gauge any given technology against this cycle to see where we are in its level of adoption. So as you can see, and this actually applies to most technologies. I think probably there are some exceptions, but I've seen many of them go through this kind of cycle. And so for any given technology, you might say that, well, we're at the peak of inflated expectations, or we're in the trough of disillusionment. So keep that in mind as we look at some of these technologies. But first, everything is online. This is the metro map for Paris, or actually a chunk of it, not even the whole thing. And I put this up here simply to illustrate the fact that we live in such a rich world of information these days that even just 10, 20 years ago, we didn't live in. So now, for example, when you travel anywhere, you can go online, you can map out everything to the nth detail. You can find places to stay, you can book them, you can, buy tickets for shows, you can, even figure out how you're going to get there and how much it's going to cost you, buy train tickets. All of that has become something you can do for yourself. Now, if that isn't personally empowering, then I don't know what is. So that's just one example of, information being online, being personally empowering. Google Books. Now, although, as we know, they've digitized millions of books, we also know that copyright prevents them from simply just opening them up for everyone. Although there's a permutation of that I'll discuss a little bit later. But a lot of these are searchable, and for a lot of them you can see snippets of text. So it's still possible to use this corpus, for example, to find quotes out of books, which might be sufficient for writing papers, school papers and so forth. So that's a game changer now. It's, I think, going to be an even bigger game changer later on. Google Scholar, of course, aggregates scholarly articles, and it's not limited to open access articles, but a lot of them here are. It also points to articles behind paywalls as well. And something like this is only going to get more and more powerful for one very important reason. And that is, increasingly, universities, and in this case, this is the University of California, just this last summer, mandated that faculty put copies of their papers up in an institutional repository at open access. There is a provision to have them gated for a certain period of time, but then they will be opened up for everyone. So increasingly then, universities are mandating that their faculty make their publications open access. And increasingly they're going into repositories such as the University of California eScholarship Repository. Now, you may object and say, well, how does that help? Because how can researchers be expected to go to, 500 individual repositories to find these things? And the answer is they don't have to, because these papers are aggregated in other locations. So, for example, OCLC WorldCat. We aggregate information about these papers in WorldCat. The Digital Public Library of America can be expected to aggregate information about these things within its portal over time. Certainly Google Scholar will and is doing that. So one of the points I want to make then is that libraries were initially founded at least within the American context, as basically buying clubs. That is, either it could be a private library where it's by subscription and you would pay in a certain amount and then the money would be pooled and buy content for all, or it could be through taxation, which of course is the standard public library model where people are taxed, the money gets pooled into a common pot, and we buy content on behalf of the clientele. And what I'd like to suggest is in this brave new world, if that's the foundation of our services, then we're skating on some pretty thin ice. And we're really only about, 2 or 3 license agreements away from an outfit like Google or Amazon or whomever to potentially fulfill the same kind of buying club role that we've been playing on behalf of our clientele. So I think we all need to be figuring out where our added value really is in this world where everything is online. And it may not all be openly accessible, or it may not all be openly accessible now, but it may in the future, or it may be available in different ways in the future at different price points that we may find hard to compete against. So Rick Anderson kind of wrote about this in his recent paper, Can't Buy Us Love, The Declining Importance of Library Books and the Rising Importance of Special Collections. And his basic point is that commodity materials, basically what you would get from a standard publisher, I mean, that's basically done. I mean, stuff is out there, it's easy to get hold of, it's easy to access in various different ways. So he's suggesting that at least in an academic library context, it's special collections where we need to be spending our time and attention. So that's definitely something to think about, especially for large research libraries. That may be part of where we add value. But I want to leave this topic now and move on to what I call the maker revolution. And this has been going on for some time, at least here in California. In Sonoma County here where I live in California, O'Reilly and Associates, which does all kinds of technology, book publishing, and conferences, for some years now has published the Make magazine and has also sponsored the Maker Fair in San Mateo. And what has happened is they have tapped into this desire by many people to take back control over creating things away from the large factory production processes and to create things themselves. And it really could be just about anything. So they, as I mentioned, they put on this Maker Fair, and when you go there, you see all kinds of things that people have created themselves. Might be strange cars like this, or it could be circuit boards that do particular kinds of things. It really is wide open in terms of the kinds of things that people make. And then also at the fair, they have opportunities for you to make things there, to learn about making things, and so forth. This has been going on for some time in electronics through such things as the Raspberry Pi, which is a very small and inexpensive circuit board, which enables you to do a variety of different tasks that you can hook into other kinds of components and do some more complex things. Also, Arduino, which is a open source electronics prototyping platform, is another very cheap piece of hardware that people are using to do some interesting things on their own. And also, when I was preparing for this talk, I stumbled on the fact that Intel has its own development board, again, an inexpensive board they call the Galileo board, that they're putting out there for this kind of maker to do things with. And that made me realize just how important this whole thing was in some way when an outfit like Intel actually pays attention to it and sees this whole maker revolution as something that they need to acknowledge and to perhaps support. So one of the reasons why I call this a revolution is if you know your communist thought, you might know this quote from Engels: "In every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged." So one of the reasons why I think this is a true revolution is, again, it's personally empowering. It's enabling people to take control over how things are created, distributed, and shared. This hasn't escaped the notice of libraries either, and we'll talk about it in a second. Nelson Mandela said this about Gandhi, that basically he favored the small machine and wanted to keep the individual in control of his tools to maintain an interdependent love relation between the two, as a cricketer with his bat or Krishna with his flute. And he seeks to liberate the individual from his alienation to the machine and restore morality to the productive process. So you might recall that famous picture of Gandhi at a spinning wheel. And that was very illustrative of this quote, that he wanted people to have control over their own ability to create. And we're getting back to that now with the Maker Revolution. And this hasn't escaped libraries. In ALA 2013, the annual conference, there was a program which was standing room only on library maker spaces. Makerspaces are appearing in libraries all over. Here's the Westport Library. They actually celebrated their first anniversary back in July of this year. So this has also been in American libraries, talking about how libraries are getting involved with makerspaces. So I would definitely keep an eye on this as a trend and something that a role that potentially libraries could play for their clientele by providing access to hardware that may be, at least initially, expensive. Although some of these machines that are being created to do 3D printing are really dropping in price, so and are increasing in their capabilities. So whereas before, a 3D printer might be only able to print in plastic, there's technologies out there which will allow you to print in metal and other kinds of materials. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on here. So the third trend that I want to talk about, before I talk about kind of general strategies to deal with some of these changes, are massively open online courses, or MOOCs. And there's many different examples or platforms of these out there. I just listed some, but there's even more than that. Khan Academy, edX, Udacity, Coursera. And increasingly, we're seeing major universities like MIT and Stanford and Berkeley that are participating in these efforts. And really what they are again, massively open, so that is, anyone can sign up. These kinds of courses will often attract tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of participants. Of course, not everyone finishes, so on and so forth. There's all kinds of issues, but nonetheless, again, this is a trend that is personally empowering because it's opening up education to virtually anyone. Now, of course, the whole accreditation thing needs to be figured out to really make change, but there's already been a lot of changes within education because of this development. So here's, for example, a list of some courses at Coursera. Shows you kind of the diversity of course offerings that are out there right now, all the way from American foreign policy to bioinformatics, design, and so forth. So there's courses out there for in just about every field, and many of these are being developed by top faculty at top universities. So it's not just on the fringes, really. So New York Times has paid attention to this. It actually called 2012 the year of the MOOC, given its impact or potential impact on higher education. And if it's going to have an impact on higher education, then it's going to have an impact on academic libraries. So recently at OCLC, we had a program in Pennsylvania about MOOCs and libraries, the impact of MOOCs potentially on libraries. These videos from the session are available on YouTube at the URL you see below. So just go to the OCLC Research YouTube channel, and you can check out those talks, which I highly recommend. I wasn't able to sit in on all of these sessions while it was happening, but I found the recordings to be very useful. And there were a number of faculty there at the University of Pennsylvania who have been involved with MOOCs for some time, and so they were quite informative on their effect. Again, we have to solve this issue, accreditation, in order for MOOCs to be truly transformative. That is, in order for this to really transform the academy, you should be able to do a series of online courses that eventually lead to a degree from a university that has some stature. Otherwise, it's just going to be a different way to do adult education. But if that is solved, then they are looking at ways to do that, largely probably by not being free anymore, but maybe lower cost than actually going to a university and in person. So, but I keep an eye on this trend, as I think it has the potential to be transformative as well. So now I want to kind of come to some ways in which I think we as individuals and as organizations can really, move forward in a time of systemic and rapid change. So one thing clearly I think we need to do is to really pay some attention as to where we add value. And again, I would suggest that it's not residing so much in being a buying club anymore, but there are many other ways in which libraries are potentially effective within their communities, and it's those areas where we need to take a look at and strengthen and build up. One thing we clearly, I think, need to do, because we're working on a standard which is now roughly 50 years old in terms of storing and transporting and using our metadata assets. So we need to move forward into richer, more granular, and more consumable metadata structures, which I believe we are doing. We're moving that way. It's slow and again, in fits and starts, but we are at least moving that direction. We also, I think, need to use a combination of batch processing plus human eyeballs to really improve the quality and accuracy of our metadata. I dig into metadata on a regular basis at my place of employment, and I can tell you that we've got some real issues regarding quality and accuracy and completeness, all kinds of things like that. But increasingly, we also have tools we can use to batch process that data, correct it in various ways, flag things that need a human to look at them, and those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and it needs to be done. We also have a lot of value locked up in individual records that we need to maximize the use of in various ways. And we're finding ways to do that, which I'll illustrate here in just a minute. And then, of course, mine the data for connections and relationships to other data. So for some examples of how we're doing that, a project here at OCLC is the Virtual International Authority file. And what we're doing here is unifying various authority files from national libraries around the world into one searchable and referenceable resource. So, for example, here's a record for me within this resource. You can see all the various countries which have a record and how they vary, and there's a link to my ISNI number and so forth. And then this is all exposed on the web as XML. So this can be grabbed and processed by anyone, and they can make links into other data sources and also make links to us as well. The Dewey Decimal Classification, which we own, is also out there as linked and linkable data, available as XML. And then we also have projects such as Kindred Works, where we're actually trying to mine value out of the work of catalogers that have been going on for all these years in order to make new kinds of services. So in this case, we're trying to be a recommendation tool to help you find books that are related to a book that you like. So say, for example, you read this book by Rita Mae Brown, and you want to find other related works. If you come here and look at the page for this book and then scroll down, you'll then find other books that we believe are related in some way using things like the genre headings and so forth. And then you can then find a book you haven't read and go off and be happy. So kind of like an automated reader service, if you will. And this is just one example of how we can do a better job of mining value out of library-built metadata repositories. We also, I think, really need to look at changing our collecting practices, because really it's never really been about having physical objects in a building. It's always been about access. And in the past, access meant having physical objects in a building. Now it often means linkages into online repositories of materials. So we really need to take into account the fact that we have these new capabilities available to us. One such capability, for example, is the HathiTrust digital library, which is basically the library managed version, if you will, of Google Books. It's actually broader than that. It includes things that Microsoft digitized and so forth. But nonetheless, this is just one source of content, increasingly available content. There are now, I believe, about 1 million volumes available openly here at the HathiTrust Digital Library. So why should that stuff not be easily available to your users? You know, and that's just one example. Increasingly, we need to think about just-in-time collections instead of just-in-case collections. And by this I mean, you know, obviously you have your existing print and digital collections, but increasingly you have this widened circle of stuff that you can either buy or rent or link to. And that should all be provided to your users as kind of this one pot of stuff. And if they want something and you don't have it, can you get it for them through interlibrary loan? Can you point them off to it in HathiTrust? Can you buy it at Amazon and send it directly to them and then have them return it to you? There's all these kinds of ways in which we need to be thinking about simply providing access to stuff in whatever way it can be done, and just being upfront with the user about what it will take to get it to them. We clearly need to create agile institutions. This has been an ongoing need for some time. Some are better at it than others. Here's various ways in which that might be done. I'm not going to go through them all. But one thing I want to point out is I've always been a fan of using task forces to accomplish real work, because standing committees often doesn't have the people in the room that you actually need to have to do the work. So I believe a standing committee is good to determine what needs to be done, and then once you have determined that, you create a task force, put the people on the task force who need to be there, whether it's the janitor or the AUL or, you know, whoever, and then you task them to do a certain thing, and then when that's done, they go away. And that's a much more effective way to actually do things than a standing committee. We need to encourage new ideas and risk-taking, but then not be afraid to kill things off if they're not providing real value. Clearly, this is going to require ongoing staff development. I graduated from library school in 1986. I'm not using a single thing I got out of that experience, at least that I can recall. And for many of you, that's probably the case as well, which means you've always been learning since you exited library school, and that's a good thing. As an institution, we need to encourage that and support it. We need to figure out what services really will be compelling to our local staff, or our local set of users, our local community, and then make that happen. And it really depends on your given situation, whether you're large academic or small academic or large public or small public or special or, you know, what have you. But, you know, you need to figure that out in association with the people that you serve, and then work at really making that happen. Really, there are no permanent parts. We have to get over thinking that there are, and build for constant change. Don't be expecting to do the same thing you're doing now 2, 3, 5 years from now. It's your personal responsibility to advance professionally. Of course, since you're even in this room, that means that you know that. So it's really the people who aren't in this room who probably need to hear this message. And then realize, of course, that, you know, by now, you know, I've forgotten more than I've learned. It was amazing how much has changed over time. Just in general, we need to be always getting ready for the new, and that means a lot of just monitoring and evaluating. I'm not saying you need to be jumping on board everything. In fact, I always say neither an early adopter nor a latecomer be. You generally want to be in the middle somewhere. but let others be the early adopters to test it out, to choose Gopher over the web the year before it becomes obvious the Gopher is going down. Let others make those mistakes, but be prepared to jump in when it looks like something's really important. So to prepare, obviously you need to have staff kind of informed early and often. I like the idea of champions. Look for people who have a natural interest in something and a propensity to learn that thing and to proselytize for it, to teach others about it, and then you kind of empower them as a champion for that technology. And then, you know, for any new innovation, we need to always be looking at it and see whether we need to cut and run or actually throw some resources behind it and take it into production, and really make those decisions early on rather than later. So to recap, we create agile institutions and foster ongoing staff development. Creating web scale for libraries is largely what OCLC is doing, which you can participate in and see some value from. Focus on offering compelling local services, which you will have to determine what those are. Refocus your staff on those services. Make sure your priorities are aligned to whoever it is you're serving. Improvise, innovate, and collaborate on a really large scale, on a global scale, really. I just want to end up, before we get to some questions, in a few small parables. I'm a Whitewater River guide, so I've learned some of my biggest lessons while running rivers. One of them was to be flexible. So one time I was running a rapid in the Grand Canyon, not this one, but one that was similar. And at the top of the rapid, I hit a wave that turned the boat. And in the Grand Canyon, if you don't hit the waves straight on, you get flipped. So since it turned the boat to one direction, rather than trying to fight that momentum and turn the boat back around straight, I followed the momentum and I turned around backwards and rode the rest of the rapid backwards, but able to hit the wave straight with my stern. And so I had to make that decision instantaneously to be flexible in how I thought it was going to unfold. This is actually a picture of me on a rock, you know, on the Stanislaus River in California, where I wrapped the boat around the rock because I couldn't decide whether to go left or right of the rock. So sometimes the most important decision is to just make the decision. Otherwise, it can be made for you. And that's not always pretty. This is me flipping in another river, the North Fork of the Yuba. This is a paddle boat where it's very important that everyone paddle together at the same time, and we didn't make it, and we flipped. And probably the most important point is to have fun while you're doing it, because if you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. So with that, I want to hear from you, what questions you might have. Steve, I suppose you can help me in determining how best that should unfold.
Absolutely. If you'd like to clap, then hover over the smiley face and hit the applause icon. You're going to be tempted to click on that hand icon at the top, but that actually means you're raising your hand, and we're going to call on you. If you do have a question and you'd like to ask it through the microphone, you can do so by clicking on that hand icon, and we'll give you the mic, or you can put the question in the chat. And Shannon, if you're ready to ask a question, I'm giving you the microphone, and you would do that by clicking on the talk button at the top left. Oh, Shannon's asking about the badge. Sorry, Roy. Hang on one second. I'll leave the badge link up for just a second.
Yeah, I would encourage people to type in the chat as well, because I can certainly see that. Oh, I see. There may be some in there. I have to scroll.
You see the one from Prema?
What was that, Steve?
So Prema asks, what kind of global collaboration do you see happen?
Well, of course, you're asking someone who works at OCLC, so forgive me if I'm going to hit that hard, but that's the single biggest, nonprofit organization out there for libraries, and we can do a lot to collaborate at a global scale. But it's also a matter of finding out, other libraries that have similar challenges and perhaps coming together around solving a particular challenge that libraries of your type and size happen to have. And thankfully, these days with all these communication technologies that are very easy to use, like Skype and so forth, you can have video conference calls with colleagues around the world. Of course, there's the whole issue about time zones, which we feel very strongly at OCLC because we're often trying to talk to colleagues in Europe and Australia, and that's virtually impossible to do at the same time. But there are ways in which you can collaborate on a global scale with like-minded and similar situated libraries.
I'm hoping that this conference is a good example.
Yeah, very good point. It's an excellent example of global collaboration. Steve, go ahead and put the badge. There you go.
Okay, so if you have a question for Roy, you can ask it in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand. The hand is the third icon over in the participant window. It's the smiley face and the person with the away clock, and then there's the hand. And we're glad to give you the microphone. Roy, I think we may be, oh, there we go. Julianne asks, got any hints for turning around Luddites? Oh, and I put another question in the moderator tab for you that had come before, and I'll grab these two as well. If you want to click on that moderator tab, I think there was a question we missed.
Okay, thanks. The question about Luddites, wow. That's a great question, and it's a very difficult one. As you can imagine, I've had to deal with those who were only reluctantly dragged along into new technologies pretty much my whole career, and I don't know that I've got a lot of great advice. It really kind of depends on the individual as to what hook you might want to use, and some people just aren't going to be turned around. So, I'm also a fan of actually firing people who don't give the program. The problem is, in most of our institutions, that's not an easy thing to do. A lot of our libraries are public institutions, and those tend to be the hardest ones to fire anyone in. So, that's a hard one. And I don't have a simple answer for it. I really don't. Where are we a hype curve for MOOCs? That's a good question. I saw something recently on Wikipedia, I think. They were citing someone who thought that we were, I think, at the top of the hype cycle for MOOCs. But the thing that I noticed there is that in the U.S., we've been talking MOOCs for a while now, and the impact isn't quite the same in other geographies. So I think you also have to talk about where you are physically when you talk about where we are in the hype cycle for MOOCs. If someone says, how do you see things going regarding open access such as UC Scholarship and being aggregated by for-profits like Google? Well, just because Google aggregates something doesn't mean other people can't. So, that's why, for example, at WorldCat, we've got, I don't know, upwards of 60 million URLs within WorldCat, and many of those are to open access content. So I think there'll always be, and of course the Digital Public Library aspires to get there at some point. So I do think there will be, non-profit sources for that data. Of course, you can argue that Google just wants to kind of make ad profit off of it, which may be true. But since we're largely talking about open access content, they can do that kind of thing.
Boy, people appreciate having a short little break before the next set of sessions, so don't feel like you need to stretch to the end. You're certainly welcome to answer.
Oh yeah, good point.
You're welcome to answer as many as you'd like.
Yeah, someone mentioned everyone should take the HyperLive MOOC at San Jose State with Michael Stevens, and I would agree. Michael's awesome. Of course, San Jose State does awesome work. Sandy's to be congratulated. So, yeah, definitely. But I think you're right. People probably do want to take a little break. So what I can suggest, though, is that I'm easily available. Just Google me. You'll know how to get a hold of me. So if you have a question that I didn't answer here or one later, just shoot me an email. Be happy to take a crack at it. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Roy. Terrific job. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn the recording off and encourage you to exit out of the room so the recording can process. Bye.